Great. Thank you all for coming. So I am Phillip Zapkin. I'm an assistant teaching professor of English at Penn State. Started coming to comparative drama, I want to say around 2015, maybe. So I've been here a little while. Also want to say it's always kind of terrifying to be on a panel with someone like Jacqueline because she knows so much, and I'm always afraid that I'm going to have something in my paper that's completely ridiculous. But I will persist nonetheless. So the paper that I'm going to be presenting today is entitled Death of Innocence, Agonistic Conflict and Ethics in Sophocles' Antigone and Guan Hanjing's Snow in Midsummer. In The Philosophy of Fine Art, German idealist philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel explained his theory of agonistic conflict as the core of Greek tragedy. He argued that tragedy is fundamentally driven not by arbitrary circumstances, the moral failures of the characters, or ill intent, but instead by a clash of competing ethical positions. As he puts it, the heroes of ancient classical tragedy discover circumstances under which they, so long as they irrefragably adhere to the one ethical state of pathos which alone corresponds to their own already formed personality, must infallibly come into conflict with an ethical power which opposes them and possesses an equal ethical claim to recognition. In other words, the conflict of tragedy is a social one, in which competing ethical stances are put into irreconcilable conflict which leads to the destruction of the characters. To illustrate this principle, Hegel calls upon Sophocles' Antigone, the conflict of which he glosses as, Antigone reverences the ties of blood kinship, the gods of the netherworld. Creon alone recognizes Zeus, the paramount power of public life and the commonwealth. While Hegel's description is obviously limited and takes a very specific view of Antigone, the concept of agonistic conflict is, nonetheless, a useful tool for understanding tragedy as a structure. However, in this presentation, I go beyond the socio-political level of Hegel's agonistics and instead trace an internal agonistic conflict within two female tragic figures, Antigone and Duo-i of Guan Hanjing's 14th century Chinese play Snow in Midsummer. Both young women are subjected to state violence and yet maintain their ethical innocence. Antigone's case is not necessarily the same as legal, yet both must compromise specific actions in order to preserve that innocence. Brief plot summaries then analyze the ethics of each main character within their socio-cultural context before touching on how these plays reflect the larger problems faced by women within stridently patriarchal societies. Beginning with Antigone, this is a story in which the titular daughter of Oedipus, former king of Thebes, disobeys the edict of Creon, her uncle and the new king of Thebes. After Antigone's brothers kill one another in combat over the crown, Creon declares that Polynices should remain unburied as punishment for attacking Thebes. Antigone, however, asserts her duty to the dead and buries her brother, an act which she refuses to repent, forcing Creon to condemn her to death. Up to her death, Antigone asserts that she has righteously fulfilled the will of the gods, even referring to my criminal conduct blameless. Turning to Snow in Midsummer, the play focuses on Duo-i, whose father has sold her to Granny Kai to marry Kai's son. Following the son's death, Granny Kai is blackmailed to marry old Zhang and force Duo-i to marry his son Donkey Zhang. However, out of loyalty to her dead husband, Duo-i refuses. Donkey Zhang poisons the soup Duo-i brings his father, and then fails once again to blackmail her into marriage. At the trial, Duo-i declares her innocence, but pleads guilty when the court threatens to torture Granny Kai. Following Duo-i's execution and the mystical signs of her innocence, her father returns as a court official, and Duo-i's spirit directs him to look into her case, revealing the injustice of her fate. The most obvious link between these two plays, which, remember, come from almost 2,000 years apart and are separated by the Asian continent, is that young women stand firmly by their principles and are punished by the lethal force of the state. In this presentation, however, the link I want to trace is in their ethical decision-making. Certainly both face an agonistic conflict in the sort of socio-political sense that Hegel describes, one ethical perspective on society confronting another. But more interesting to me is how the cultural norms surrounding both Antigone and Dwo-e forced them to face an internal agonistic conflict. Each society's socio-cultural norms pull the two figures in conflicting directions, directions embodied by the other female characters in both plays, Antigone's sister Ismene and Dwo-e's mother-in-law Granny Kai. In the opening scene of Antigone, the title character reveals to her sister that their brothers have been killed and that Creon has denied Polynices burial under pain of death. Antigone attempts to recruit Ismene into her plan to bury the body anyway, but Ismene demurs. She essentially argues that neither girl has the strength or the right to defy the government, cautioning Antigone, "Remember, we're women. How can we fight men? They're stronger. We must accept these things, and worse to come. I want the spirits of the dead to understand this. I'm not free. I must obey whoever's in charge." Now, particularly in the pre-democratic world of the Greek heroic age in which this story is set, obedience to a sovereign was a key element of social stability, though by the time Sophocles' play was performed, the Athenian democracy was well established and Ismene's deference might be less politically appealing. On the other hand, 5th century BCE Athens was a deeply patriarchal society in which women had very few rights, even by the standards of much of the ancient world, and so Ismene's capitulation would be appropriate for her gender. But, perhaps more persuasively, Ismene reminds Antigone that their family's tendency to headstrong overconfidence has destroyed everyone except the two of them at this point in the play. By the end of the play, Antigone joins that group. Ismene recounts, partly for the audience and partly to persuade Antigone, that their father-brother Oedipus committed those horrible deeds, all self-inflicted, all self-detected. Their mother Jocasta hanged herself after the incestuous relationship was revealed, and that their brothers' unyielding thirst for the crown killed them both. In reminding Antigone of their family lineage, Ismene essentially counsels nothing in excess, one of the maxims carved into the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. Greek ethics privileged moderation, and the excesses of tragic protagonists served partly as a warning of the dangers of taking things to extremes. Although Antigone ignores Ismene's pleas for moderation and submission to the authority of the state, Ismene nevertheless plays an important role within the play by offering Antigone an ethical counterpoint for her behavior. Ismene gives Antigone an alternative course of action fully rooted within ancient Greek ethics, that of moderation. Similarly, in Snow in Midsummer, Granny Kai represents a competing Confucian justification for Dwo-e agreeing to marry Donkey Zhang. Having been married to Granny Kai's son, Dwo-e is bound to both of them by relational networks foundational to Confucian ethics. Dwo-e asserts devotion to her dead husband as a justification for refusing to marry Donkey Zhang. And actually, in a speech peppered with examples from Chinese history and myth, Dwo-e recounts tales of women entirely devoted to their husbands, contrasting these virtuous examples against modern women. And she characterizes modern women. They're all of them faithless, all run after new lovers, and before their husbands' graves are dry, they set aside their mourning for new clothes. So shameful that women today how shameful that women today are so unfaithful, so few of them chaste, so many wanton. All are gone, those virtuous women of old, for wives will not cleave to their husbands. This was obviously written by a man. In her loyalty to her husband, even beyond his death, Dwo-e reflects Confucian values about the proper relationships between spouses. As the Book of Rites states, faithfulness is requisite in all service of others, and faithfulness is specially the virtue of a wife. Once mated with her husband, all her life she will not change her feelings of duty to him, and hence, when husband dies, she will not marry again. Indeed, the spousal relationship is one of the 5 major relationships upon which social stability is built in Confucian philosophy, along with the relationship between ruler and subject, father and son, older brother and younger brother, and between friends. Thus, by refusing to remarry, Dwo is carrying out her ethical duty. However, Dwo has another ethical duty under Confucianism in that she must honor and obey her mother-in-law. She describes her own conduct before the Zhangs enter the picture. "So I mourn for my husband and serve my mother-in-law, obedient to all her bidding." Dwo refuses Granny Kai's injunction to marry Donkey Zhang, asserting that her devotion to her husband should be the superior force. She continues to refuse the marriage even when Donkey Zhang poisons the soup Dwo brings to his father in order to blackmail her. Basically, he offers to not have her prosecuted for murder if she agrees to marry him, in case that wasn't clear from my gloss of the plot. When Dwo and Granny Kai are brought before the prefect, he tortures Dwo and then threatens to torture Granny Kai. And this is finally what persuades Dwo to compromise her integrity and falsely confess to the poisoning, an admission the prefect is happy to accept even though Dwo points out that she confessed only to save Granny Kai from torture, saying, "I was forced to confess that I poisoned the old man. How could I let you be beaten, mother? How could I save you except by dying myself?" Dwo compromises her honor by making a false confession, one which leads to her execution, in order to fulfill the Confucian virtue of filial piety, though she had refused to heed Granny Kai's injunction to marry Donkey Zhang earlier in the play. Both Antigone and Dwo face a kind of agonistic choice, with ethical responsibilities pulling them in contradictory directions, and yet both remain steadfast in their moral convictions, facing death to remain unsullied. I argue that their comparable plotlines reflect a common trend in the social disciplining of women, the internalization of guilt. Both Antigone and Dwo submit to their unjust deaths, in part because patriarchal societies condition women to accept even unfounded guilt. Ismene argues that Antigone has violated Hellenic norms of moderation and female submission, and Granny Kai demands that Dwo honor her by submitting to a marriage betraying Dwo's first husband. Both protagonists are stuck between an ethical rock and a moral hard place. Either decision is taboo. In this sense, therefore, within Greek and Chinese patriarchal worldviews, Antigone and Dwo are inherently guilty and deserving of punishment. Each has violated the norms of their culture, and so the punishments they face are, in some metaphysical sense, socio-culturally justified, even if the two women are innocent. Again, literally in Dwo's case and morally in Antigone's self-assessment. However, things don't quite end there, because the other striking dimension of both Antigone and Dwo is that their behavior actually moves them out of their socially sanctioned roles, thereby unsettling any simplistic reading of guilt and innocence within patriarchally constructed norms. Here I follow the argument that Judith Butler lays out in Antigone's Claim, but many of the broad points comparably apply to Guan's protagonist. Butler challenges the assumption in Hegel, and of course many other critics, that Sophocles' title character is aligned with familial relations. As Butler points out, Antigone instead deforms kinship networks, both as a product of an incestuous relationship and through her own masculine behavior. Through her defiance of injustice and her command of rhetoric, Antigone undercuts the expectations of what a Theban woman should be. As Butler puts it, her actions compel others to regard her as manly and thus cast doubt on the ways that kinship might underwrite gender. Her language paradoxically most closely approximates Creon's, the language of sovereign authority and action. In other words, by performing masculinity through acting and speaking on issues of political and religious import, Antigone breaks, or at least bends, the socially constructed gender roles within patriarchal Greek society. Comparably, Dwo's actions align her with the dominant position in Confucian relationships rather than in the subordinate position. The most obvious example of this inversion is her ethical critiques of Granny Kai. In these interactions, Dwo takes on the role of the ethical teacher and role model, the parental position as opposed to the child's role, inverting the socially sanctioned relationship between herself and her mother-in-law. Similarly, when her father returns to the area, the the intervention of Dwo-E's spirit, putting her case at the top of his stack of files, is the only way he discovers the prefect's very unconfucian, willful miscarriage of justice. In other words, it is she who takes the lead in revealing the failure of a public official. As with Granny Kai, Dwo-E takes on the dominant role rather than deferring to a man who is both her father and a court official. The irony, then, with both Antigone and Dwo-E is that remaining within the confines of the dominant ethical systems of their times effectively pushes them outside the bounds of those ethical systems. Because of mutually exclusive moral demands on each of them as women, fulfilling certain injunctions precludes meeting others, and the attempt to meet their moral obligations drives them beyond the scope of their prescribed gender roles. Thank you.